Thank you so much. I am Chief Technology Officer at Onfido, Latin, as opposed to the American pronunciation. We're based in London, so I'm normally in London, but I've been quarantining in Seattle just to have a little bit more space and some woods around me. So this talk today is something I've given before. It's something that I felt a little bit compelled to write. I've been doing Agile or working in an Agile fashion now for about 20 years. I started right around 2000. I'd been at Microsoft for a number of years where we were doing, obviously enterprise scale waterfall, work on Windows with multi-year releases, very traditional approach, very industrial approach to building software. And I'd seen a lot of challenges as an individual contributor and as a manager in that environment. And so when I joined a startup after leaving Microsoft, and one of the first books on Agile, Extreme Programming, had come out, and the chief architect of the company had read it and was very interested, and I thought, why not? And ever since that very first company where we adopted Agile practices, that is literally the only way I've worked since. Even when I eventually did go back to Microsoft, I was able to let them I was able to then pilot one of the very first, if not the very first, Agile projects at Microsoft, just because I couldn't stand to go back to working in that waterfall way. So I've been doing this for a long time. I feel very obviously passionate about it. But over the last few years, I've started to see things like this, either blog posts or articles, people not just sort of disliking Agile, which is okay. It's a set of practices. It's whatever frameworks, whatever you want to, however you want to describe it. But to the point where people not only just said, well, it's not something I would prefer to use, they were actually really hated it very passionately, and I just couldn't understand it. It just showed to me, what it showed was just a fundamental lack of understanding what Agile actually was and how it worked. And I'd had all these really good experiences. So, if you look and if you find some of these, you'll see my name sometimes in the comments, especially on Twitter, because I just couldn't let, statements like that go, especially where it seemed like what they were describing as Agile had no relationship to any of my experience, having done it in lots of different companies. And so you'll see often when you see something like that, you'll see my name there. And it got to the point where this was just coming so much, and it was really interesting to me because it seemed like a real wave. And again, the passion around why people's dislike of Agile was so strange to me. It seemed like a lot of people had just been sort of scared by an Agile clown or something when they were young. And I was trying to understand sort of what happened and why there was this sort of, over the last few years, just this big wave of kind of anti-Agile or Agile backlash in the industry. And I saw something like this. This is HP did a brief on Agile is the new normal. And so, as I said, I actually started working Agile around 2000. And for a long time, it was a very nascent, I would be searching out companies that did it, and you'd have to search out companies that were working Agile, and eventually it just kind of seemed that it was becoming just very much more common. And the HP did some studies and actually saw, there was a real inflection point to where they're saying, about 6 years ago, it became sort of now the default. Agile is now the default. You also started to see Agile kind of move out of software and development into things like showing up in HBR in other kinds of ways where you saw things like Lean Six Sigma or Agile Six Sigma showing up in other kind of non-software areas. The word started getting a little bit, to be honest, polluted. So, you go to Amazon, you get over 6,000 results for books on Agile. Probably the biggest marker of success, you might say, or not, would be now you had companies. I know there's folks, former Deloitte folks. When Deloitte or one of the other big name consultancies start selling you Agile transformation, where they'll show up, spend 6 months and turn you Agile, that's normally a sign that this is now kind of what people want to do, but not necessarily what they know how to do. You also started seeing things like this, obviously, as things became more mainstream. You started to see lots and lots of certifications show up. And there is no governing body of Agile. There's no one that decides what Agile sort of is or what is a certified Agile practitioner. And so these certifications have just proliferated, and to the extent that they've more or less, from my perspective, are mostly meaningless. So you had, from my experience starting in earlier days of Agile to now, when I started doing Agile, it was very much a response to sort of the ways we wrote software in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Agile was, at that time, this really kind of punk thing, where we were sort of from the bottom up taking control of how we built specifically software. And Agile became much more mainstream, much more, dare I say, corporate. We started talking a lot more about uppercase, what I would call uppercase A Agile. So there was a big transformation. This is like any other kind of practice that we have in the industry. It starts in some area and becomes mainstream, and as a result, either becomes more formalized or becomes less so. Agile, the problem is it hasn't. Lots of people will try and tell you that it's formalized, but it actually isn't. As I said, there's no governing body. There's no one that decides what is Agile and what isn't Agile. So if you ask 5 different people, even 5 experienced Agile practitioners, people who have been doing it for a long time, what is Agile? Well, there'll be some overlap, but there's not necessarily going to be an agreement about it. Each of us has sort of a different approach to it. And part of the reason this happens is Agile there is no rule book to Agile. It's really, from my perspective, and a mindset. You have frameworks like Scrum, like SAFe, like Kanban, but then you have all the things in between, the Scrumban, the extreme programming, rational. All these things are all Agile. They share some commonalities, and they do not in other ways, as they're approached. They're sets of tools that are all unified around more of a mindset, a way of thinking, than around a very specific, very structured approach. And that creates a problem, especially when this is being applied in lots of different places and lots of different industries and towards lots of different problems. And that problem manifests itself if I'm a person in a company where when we adopted Agile, it was very much a bottom-up thing where we adopted it and brought it to the company. Now, oftentimes, and probably in a lot of the organizations you may be part of, Agile isn't something you choose to do as sort of a member of a team or somebody building something for a company. Agile is now something that's forced on you by a senior leadership person like myself, where they may have either heard from another company or read about Agile or met someone at a conference, decided that Agile would solve whatever problems the organization was currently suffering, brought in someone to help train, and then kind of forced it onto the larger organization, like many other, to be honest, many other kind of programs in large organizations. In the 2017 version 1 State of Agile report, they looked at what the challenges were implementations of Agile, for Agile transformations in companies, and what caused those to fail. The number one cause is organizational culture being at odds with Agile values. Because, as I said, it's really a mindset, it's a way of thinking, it's a way of approaching problems, more so than a specific framework or a specific way of implementing these ideas. Normal cultural things like also as organizational resistance to change, lack of management support, those kinds of things that you're probably used to with any sort of introduction of a program into an organization. But that culture one is a really critical one specifically for Agile. And that is because this Agile way of thinking in an organization that doesn't have this mindset, you can bring in the programs, you can bring in the frameworks, you can bring in the structures, but that's not going to make the organization into an Agile organization if that culture to support it isn't there. So Agile transformation without that cultural transformation is what makes people angry. If you look at a lot of these blog posts or Twitter threads or whatever, where it's people kind of railing against Agile and explaining why Agile is bad, when you look at their own experiences, this was Agile transformation imposed upon them without any kind of organizational or cultural support around it. So it was a set of processes that they didn't understand, a way of working that wasn't really supported by the way the organization performed. And as a result, you just created lots of friction and lots of angry people. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Kubler-Ross change curve. What tends to happen in lots of these kind of transformations or adoptions, you hit this kind of this valley of despair. You get tired of just all the frustration you're dealing with learning this new way of working, and you abandon it. And that happens a lot in these sort of Agile transformations because they don't have the cultural support in place to actually allow people to work in this way if they want to or as they learn it. So for us, those of you who are either thinking about adopting Agile, those of you who are leading Agile transformations, or those of you who are even in Agile organizations and trying to kind of get to that next level of maturity, how do we overcome this problem? Well, like any other sort of cultural transformation or any kind of transformation, we need to obviously tell better stories. We need to sell these ideas in a better way. We need to explain to people why it's going to work. But I would say here, storytelling itself is not enough. That's a start. That's the basis of any kind of successful project implementation, telling the story of what it's going to look like when it's there. But we actually need to transform the organization if we want, specifically, if we want Agile to be successful. So this talk is actually structured a little bit as a sort of a case study in how I did this at a previous company where I was the chief technology officer. Prior to being at Onfido, I was a chief technology officer at a company called Avo being a legal marketplace. I joined there after 3 years at Spotify. So I was a VP at Spotify. Spotify, for those of you who maybe you're familiar with the product but you're not familiar with the company, Spotify is probably one of the most advanced Agile companies, especially at scale in the world. In that multi-thousands of people working together building a single product in an Agile way. I was there for 3 years. I'd come from Adobe, which you may also be familiar with. Adobe was a very good kind of Agile company in that very mature Agile processes, but it wasn't what I would call sort of from a corporate perspective, a very Agile kind of Agile company. Spotify, moving to that company, spending 3 years there, my own level of proficiency and my own understanding it was significantly enhanced. So I was coming out of that environment and I was coming to a new company, a much smaller company. Avo was about 400 people at the time. For me, coming out of that environment, obviously I wanted to create that environment again. I thought Ava would be a good place to do that when I was interviewing and talking to people there. Uh, they had, number one, they had good values that I thought would be very supportive of a good agile culture. Uh, Senior leadership was feeling a very clear mandate to improve and very much didn't think that everything was working well, thought that there was a lot of room for improvement. They were already using agile practices and agile frameworks in their day-to-day work. And it seemed, at least from the context of an interview, when I interviewed there, that their agile was pretty good. Their agile practices were okay. When I showed up though and started working, I started to see some what I would consider sort of red flags. One being talking to a developer, they said to me, well, testing, uh, quality assurance, that's not agile. And I said, why would you say that? There's nothing about agile that says that testing isn't agile. But they were very adamant that testing wasn't agile, and I had to explain, well, unit testing is has been part of agile from the beginning. There's a lot of quality built in. They were unsure. Then I heard from the same person, well, documentation isn't agile, and I said, well, okay, in the Agile manifesto, it says, we prefer working software over comprehensive documentation. That doesn't mean that we don't believe, that documentation itself isn't agile. It's just that documentation isn't more important than working software. Because in the Agile manifesto, it says, while there is value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. Then I heard from another developer, even, code commenting in the work is not agile. And I started to realize what I was hearing from people was, whatever I don't want to do, I can just say isn't agile, and then that's my excuse to not do it. Which to me meant we were doing agile, we were using agile practices, but we weren't really agile in the sense that we didn't have that kind of agile mindset. The practices that have been introduced, they've been taught, people were sort of following them by rote, what I would call by the book, Scrum, and maybe getting some value out of it, but not really, really becoming a truly agile organization. So looking back at that version 1 report, I was seeing a lot of these kind of challenges. Some not so much, but some definitely so. The good news, if you could call it the good news, at that company was that we had a sort of a burning platform moment. And I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with this metaphor, but the idea being that the company was well understood that what we were doing wasn't working and we needed to move to a much better place. And so there was support throughout the organization. There wasn't a lot of people trying to protect doing business as usual or saying the way we've always done things is the way we should continue to do them. That was a lucky for me because for folks I talk to who make a living out of doing agile transformations, fighting that battle is a particularly difficult one. We didn't have that. That made it my work a little bit easier. And what I wanted to do was, and the way that I saw to move forward was to take a 3-prong approach. So for those of you who are introducing Agile into organizations, Agile practices, I think it has to be, normally you might just look at training. Training with some specific Agile tooling involved as well. To me, that is a start, but that isn't going to be as successful as really taking this full 3-pronged approach of training, culture, and tooling. And when I talk about tooling, I mean not only using software tooling that helps you implement Agile, but I mean actually the tooling that the organization needs in order to function as an Agile organization. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And again, I know lots of you are in government or you're in these kind of different kinds of organizations. I'm talking very specifically about a software organization, but most of these ideas are very well scaled to the broader, to other industries as well. So I want to talk a little bit, just very briefly, about the way I think about the center prong, this cultural transformation. So the way I tend to think about this as sort of a senior leader, right? As someone who could very much do a very top-down, we were this way, we're now going to be this way, everyone, this is now who we are. That I haven't seen work very well in my own experience and in organizations, large and small, that I've been in. And so that's not my approach. I tend to think about these kind of transformations very much as planting a garden. The idea being that if you want to put a new garden in at your house, you maybe find an area, you dig it up, you amend the soil, you know, do whatever you need to do, and then you plant plants where you think they should be, and you pick the plants that you want to put in the ground. You have an idea of what it will look like eventually, but you can't in advance say, at this very precise spot, I'm going to have a rose. That rose is going to be this tall. It's going to have 8 petals. It's going to have, you know, 7 thorns. It's going to be exactly like this. The color, that's not really your choice. Your choice, you can guide, you can help, but in the end, it's going to be what it's going to be. And the more that you try and control it, the more you're going to be disappointed. Instead, you make things, you set the conditions, you guide, you put in some controls, you weed where you need to, you water, but what grows is what's going to grow. And if you do it right, you have a beautiful garden. It's not going to be exactly what you might plan in advance, but it'll be something that works quite well. And that's the way I think about these kind of transformations. So rather than saying top down, we're going to do agile transformation, or we're going to improve our agile practices, this is how you're going to do this, and this is the timeline we're going to do it on. Instead, I took a much sort of longer term approach of trying to grow it from within the organization, bring those ideas and that mindset to the organization, and then use that to improve our agile performance. So step one for me was I hired an agile coach. Now, obviously, whether you call it an agile coach, whether you call it a scrum master, I actually think these are different roles, but I have heard them used interchangeably. To me, an agile coach is not necessarily dependent on any specific agile framework or agile implementation, but more fluent with lots of different variants of agile facilitation, agile thinking. And I wanted somebody specifically who was going to be my partner in crime, that was going to help me do this development and do this cultural growth. So I needed somebody who at least had a pretty good understanding of agile, at least as close at mine or beyond mine. I wanted somebody who also, obviously me as a senior leader, or you potentially being somebody in a role where you're influencing change, or you have a positional authority, I wanted somebody who didn't necessarily have that, who could function at various levels of the organization, be my eyes into the group. And I also wanted someone who could challenge and push on me on some of my weirder ideas. So I wanted that other person in the organization to just be a second voice, because I didn't have that person when I joined. I also wanted to bring Agile in, but without I quote Agile, or what I might call capital A Agile, right? So bring in these Agile practices without necessarily bringing in very specific Agile frameworks or prescription around how Agile would be done. Just to, again, create that sort of cultural support to make sure that the Agile transformation, when we completed it, would stick and would be supported by the whole company. So found ways to sneak in just kind of agile thinking, agile ways of doing things, from little things like, bringing in the idea of lean coffee, if you're familiar with that. If not, it's a way to create a agenda for a meeting without doing it in advance. So it's a very much used in agile communities, and it is an agile thinking mindset type of facilitation method, but it isn't any specific kind of framework. Similarly with the notion of unconferences. And part of this was also bringing through the idea of bringing more autonomy into the organization, bringing in more bottom-up thinking as opposed to top-down thinking, and exposing the organization to these ideas. Both of these are well documented if you're unfamiliar with them, and you can find more information about them. At the executive team level, I also wanted to bring in some of these agile concepts, because I found that if you oftentimes when you do an agile transformation, it's limited to a specific area of an organization. And what happens is that part of the organization, wherever it interfaces with the larger organization that may not be working in that way, you have friction. And that friction is what tends to kind of push you back into that trough of despair in the change curve. So I wanted the larger organization to be part of this agile way of thinking, not just my part of the organization, because I wanted to avoid these frictions. So also, I think you probably see this in your organizations. I definitely see this, especially in smaller organizations and startups where they're used to being able to do lots of things simultaneously. As the organization grows and becomes more formalized and a little bit more structured, you change in some of that flexibility and the ability to maybe do lots of things poorly, which is fine when you're a small kind of growing organization, not so great when you're now an established organization with longtime customers and goals to hit. So I wanted to bring in these ideas of specifically work in progress, or WIP limits. There's only so much we can do at any given time, so let's be aware of that. And then also bring in the concepts around creating strict prioritization within the organizations, building an organizational level backlog. These are the things that we can do now and achieve. There's other things we want to do. Let's come to them later, and let's put those in an order that are agreed upon by the senior leadership. We also started bringing in the idea of retrospectives, and I call this retrospective instead of postmortem or after action report, which we had some of in different parts of the organization, but I wanted to bring in this idea of blameless retrospection or retrospectives, a guided process, some of the agile retrospective facilitation techniques. I wanted to use that both for successful projects as well as unsuccessful ones. And so I would start bringing in the idea of, hey, we just had this kind of company level project that went particularly well. Let's do a retrospective on it and capture why that went well. So the next time we do something like that, we'll be able to use that. And you may be doing that already in your projects that you lead, but at least in a lot of companies that haven't really built a strong project management or a strong agile way of thinking, this isn't common. So, and when they do it, tend to do it without that. If it's not an agile company, they do it in a very different way. I wanted to really both celebrate successful projects as well as understand what our challenges were with the unsuccessful ones, and then keep that knowledge and share it with a larger organization. And by doing it for both successful and unsuccessful projects, got a lot more traction, got a lot more involvement with it, because it didn't feel like it was just a blame game. We had to rethink accountability in an agile environment. I think one of the biggest challenges I've had where I've been sort of leading an agile team in a large organization that wasn't agile is this issue around accountability. Now, traditionally, what you tend to see certainly in companies, definitely in government, with my experience talking to government folks, is that accountability is set by milestones with deliverables, and that is, if you look at traditional management literature for people managers, for organizational executives, it is very much this mindset of if you work for me, you are going to make a commitment to deliver a certain thing by a certain date, and if you don't, well, there's a very clear accountability gap there. That doesn't tend to work very well with agile project development. And you have things like SAFe that try and accommodate some of those things. I wanted to see if we could instead think about accountability in a new way. And so we moved very much towards a model where instead of having milestones, this feature wasn't delivered on this date, therefore this team is not achieving what it's supposed to. Instead, think a little bit more about what the outcomes were supposed to be. Very much move to an outcome-driven kind of measure of accountability, where we found the specific metrics, and again, and also trying to drive more of a data-driven approach here, specific metrics that specific teams could own, that they were in a position to uniquely influence. They may not be the primary, or they would be the primary driver. They may not be the only driver, but they would be the ones that would be responsible for these metrics. These metrics are very much tied, in our case, to business success, either directly or very clearly indirectly. These weren't vanity metrics. But the idea being that if these metrics were moving in the right direction, the team was doing what it was expected to be doing. And having that accountability, that also allowed the team to also be measuring themselves and knowing where they were against what the expectations were. And so that also gave us a much more real-time understanding of how the team was doing, because that metric was being measured constantly, but also gave the team good sets, and then we could look at performance over time. We could tie that back to specific projects that the team was enacting. That would also help them learn what was more effective and what was less effective. The next step was educating the broader organization on Agile. Again, I think one of the big problems I've seen when companies or organizations adopt Agile, but they adopt it in certain parts of the organization, any part that interfaces with the larger organization, that tends to be a problem. Because if the finance team at a company is working in a very traditional quarterly goals and those kinds of things, and they're expecting to project based on the way they've always done it, and you have this team doing Agile and it doesn't map very cleanly, there's always pressure back to go back to the way things were because the rest of the company doesn't understand it. So I wanted everyone to be familiar, even if they weren't doing this in their day-to-day work, to be at least familiar with the concepts, familiar with the way of working, familiar with the mindset. So the way we did this was actually a very kind of sneaky, to be honest, way, but deliberately sneaky. We created an Agile 101 class that was originally specifically for, in our case, product development, because we wanted to make sure, even though we were doing Agile practices in the teams, I thought the implementation was uneven. I thought some teams were more advanced, some teams were less. I wanted to create a common vocabulary. I wanted to make sure we were all talking about Agile concepts in the same way. It was an afternoon, and it was kind of fun. If you've ever done this, one of the things we were doing was building marshmallow towers using marshmallows and spaghetti. That's as a way of teaching kind of Agile principles. If you've done these kind of Agile trainings, you might have done this, or you've seen other people do it. We did that, but we did that in a glass-walled conference room facing the cafeteria. So everyone saw this in the company. They saw people having fun, they saw this, and were interested. We required it for my organization because I could do that, but we opened it up to the whole company. As people saw this and saw that looked interesting, they joined, and eventually about 2/3 of the company actually went through this training, including all the different functions, including those that had never traditionally been in an Agile organization or worked in an Agile way. Separately, I mentioned tools being one of those prongs. Tools was important. Now, normally when we talk about Agile tool support, we think really about like a version 1 or Trello or something like that. In my case, obviously we were using those tools, but that wasn't the primary thing I was concerned about. If your organization needs to operate in an Agile way, the organizational infrastructure needs to support it, not just specifically around Agile practices, but others as well. So for us, as a software company, iteration and bring value to customer quickly and all these kinds of things that we tend to think of as Agile principles or Agile values requires actual software infrastructure support to make it happen. And when I joined the company, it really wasn't there. So it was critical for me to also make sure that the product and the way we built our product allowed us to work in an Agile way. Now, it's way easier for us in software than it might be in manufacturing, but manufacturing has been learning a lot of these things as well, specifically because they want some of these benefits of working in an agile way or a lean way, to the point where now with fashion you have companies producing very small runs and putting them into stores very quickly, or new shoes, or using 3D printing to bring products to market in limited runs very quickly so that they can actually iterate on their products in the market. Governments, we work with Onfido, we work with both the US but also very closely with the UK government, and having spent a large amount of time either working with the DCMS, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport there, but also with the ICO there, and the Government Digital Services in the UK. They've been figuring out how to do this and how to test and iterate on these things, even in the services that they provide to their citizens. And so there is opportunity to really approach this and think about ways, even in a non-software world, that you can do this in organizations, bringing and iterating faster. So we specifically, because we're a software company, very much focused on removing impediments to bringing to iteration in the way we produced our software. That was independent of Agile itself, but was necessary in order to work in a much more agile way. The next step is really taking Agile from something you do to Agile being who you are as an organization. Now for us, and for a lot of my own experience, a lot of that is actually comes down to who you hire and how you look at performance within the organization. Oftentimes, when you're hiring, you're looking at very specific skill sets, usually around whatever it is your organization is delivering. Very specifically, we made sure that Agile and Agile mindset was part of the requirements around who we hired. It's very specifically because we wanted to bring in the ambient level of Agile maturity for the people we brought into the organization. We wanted to raise that bar. That just brings more people who have seen success in an Agile way, who like working in an Agile way. That just brings more of those voices into the conversations. So when teams are looking at how they deliver or how they work, and you don't have just a group of people who this is all new to and are unsure with it, talking about it, you now actually have somebody in the team that's a member of the team that has the same KPIs as everyone else, saying, no, in a previous company we did it this way and it worked really, really well. We should really give this a try. That was significantly helpful. Now, if you're not hiring a lot, that's a little bit harder, obviously, but when that is a really good way to continue to inject this way of thinking into the organization as you go forward. Finally, again, opening the process to all, so it's not just part of the organization, it's really the organization understands how this is working. Again, the primary problem I've had in organizations that adopted Agile in narrow ways or in parts of the organization was every place those Agile teams touched teams working in a more traditional way, there was a lot of friction and a lot of things where you were having to shim Agile to look like not Agile to the rest of the organization who didn't understand it. So rather than have it be Agile be hidden away in this part of the organization and everybody else working exactly how they ever did, instead we tried to make it so that we were very open and very transparent about the way we worked. Everything from bringing in everybody, making end of sprint demos, to a fun thing that not only could you see what was happening and new things that were showing up for our customers, but make it actually a fun event. Sharing the artifacts from our planning sessions. So I mentioned sprint planning here, but part of it for us was we had some teams doing Kanban, some teams doing by the book Scrum, some teams doing more kind of Scrum-Bon, based on whatever that team's level of maturity was and what made sense for how they worked. We also started knowledge sharing a lot more, especially as we became a little bit more confident in our own practices. We started finding other organizations, not only software, and not only companies, that we thought were doing some really interesting interesting things, and just chatting with them, going over, visiting them. They would come and visit us. We'd have lunch. We'd spend a couple hours just talking about the ways they were approaching problems. And that also exposed my team, especially my senior leadership team, to these ideas and to sort of the wider world of agile thinking and how other companies were applying some these same sort of fundamentals to the problems that they had. So I just described 7 different things that we did in this one company. The question obviously is, well, it sounded great. Did it actually work? The answer was, yeah, it did. It wasn't fast. This is not something that you can do in a 6-month project. This really was a year, to be honest, of kind of that setting the ground and getting to a place where we were sort of on the other side of that change curve and kind of climbing up the other side. And then another year of just continuing to improve and evolving our practices. Given obviously that length of time, yeah, we lost people on the way. So whenever you're going to do a cultural transformation, which really this was an agile cultural transformation that brought with it an agile practices transformation, as opposed to an agile practices transformation that we would hope was going to drive an agile cultural transformation. Whenever things change, some people are going to choose not to be part of that change. And that was okay. I expected it. Obviously we're going to end this process as a very different organization. Some people are going to choose not to be part of that, and that's what I expected. I will say one of the things I think was challenging was some of the folks that we lost along the way were folks who actually were very dedicated to kind of working in this way, and just they were tired of waiting for it. They'd been waiting before I joined the company. They'd been advocating for working this new way. They knew we were moving that way, but it just wasn't fast enough for them, which was, to me, that was a little bit more of a surprise, to be honest. So we lost some people on the way, which was obviously good, not the best, but was expected. The good part was teams took control of their processes. This became, as teams developed their own agile sort of understanding and agile mindset, they took more control of their processes and drove their own improvements. They requested more training and coaching, which for me was a big sign. It wasn't something that was being pushed to them. They were now pulling, which meant that they saw value in, specifically, a lot of them had never, almost none of them had ever worked with sort of an agile coach role. They not only saw the value of them, but really wanted more of their time. Velocity increased. We were now delivering on a much faster cadence as we came through the other side of this and delivering value much faster. The number of our tests increased because quality is a critical part of this. And as you increase velocity, you have to have more automation around testing and quality control, and that absolutely increased. Customers were getting value much faster, and I'm speeding up a little bit because I'm conscious of the time. And most importantly, or one of the most important things, was team happiness increased. So we, like many organizations, were doing surveys of our employees to understand sort of how they were, and over the course of the first year of this transformation, employee happiness, as self-reported anonymously, increased 40%, which is just truly, obviously, a massive outcome. But as we were a for-profit company, revenues also significantly increased because now we were bringing more value to our customers. We were able to respond to changes in the marketplace, to changes in customer need. We were able to try ideas without investing a huge amount of energy into them, and validate them, and then build on them if they were successful. So it ended up being working quite well that way. In the end, we were not just doing Agile, we had become Agile. And to me, that is what good Agile looks like. So we have a few minutes I can do some questions if you want to share those with me. I'm aware of time, and I apologize for that.
Oh, thank you so much. Anthony McDonald has a question about, do you recommend a book that represents all the agile in its forms?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are. I can't think of a single book, to be honest. If I look back at sort of how my own agile kind of experience and practices been, it's just I've just grabbed every agile book I could find and read it over the years. But I think, Agile Estimate, I go back to some of the classics, obviously the Scrum book, Extreme Programming book, Safe Agile Estimation and Planning, but also some of the cultural change books, Henrik Nieberg's books, From the Trenches, the Kanban books, all it's the whole point is that this is a big universe, and you have to find the things that make sense to you and build them into your own approach to the practice.
Mm-hmm. And as far as the agile, the shifts to the culture, to the agile mindset, I mean, what
Yeah.
was the challenge? What's the first thing you can do? You made some examples of people didn't think documentation or testing, but how did you start moving that momentum that direction? What was the thing that made it happen?
Yeah, I think really what it was, if somebody's going to make that statement, you can just debate, like, which was where I initially started. Well, what are you talking about? Like, there's nothing that says that this isn't or is or isn't. And that's where I came to this understanding that you can define agile more or less however you want it. So that was really, it wasn't anything specific. It was really this kind of slow introducing these ideas, showing the value of them one after another, and these things just ended up taking sort of care of itself. When you were shipping more frequently, when I joined, we were shipping on we were releasing things to customers on a very strict timeline, very kind of enterprise style train, and that meant that you could have a lot more manual testing before something went to customers for quality control. When teams were now able to ship multiple times a day and bring out things much faster, that didn't work anymore. You had to write tests. Otherwise your quality would suffer. And in the case for software developers, that means you get woken up in the middle of the night. So there is a very good kind of cost benefit analysis. Do I want to get woken up in the middle of the night? No, I should probably have more tests. Same with documentation. You have somebody new join the team, and if they don't have any documentation, you now have to spend lots of time teaching them this stuff instead of saying, oh, you can just look at it here, it's all written down.
And just between us, tell us a real story about the Spotify Agile.
So what's funny to me is the Spotify scaled agile model was never meant to be something that Spotify was exporting to other people. And it was something that we wrote about to inform the rest of the industry and to share, hey, this is this thing we tried. And if you look, especially there's really not a lot of documentation about it. The documentation is a single white paper and then 2 videos. That's really the Spotify, and then a bunch of conference talks, including some from me, talking about it. But really, that was just us saying, hey, we tried this way of working. It worked pretty cool. You might like some of these ideas. Instead, what people did was take that limited amount of information and try and apply it in lots of different contexts, which made no sense at all. Spotify's model worked extremely well. Do not believe I was there for it. I lived in it and I worked in it for years. I helped evolve it as the company grew. It worked extremely well for that period of time. Absolutely. But it was very much tied to who Spotify's culture was as a company, which meant that when other companies would try and what we cargo cult it and just apply it in very different kind of cultures, it tended not to do very well, which was not surprising. What I anyway would tell people when they would ask me about it was, take the ideas. The Spotify model was us stealing ideas from lots of other places. Spotify did not invent the matrix organization model. Spotify did not invent a lot of these ideas. We coalesced them from other places and brought them together in sort of a unique way. steal the ideas from us that make sense for your company and your culture, and then abandon the other ones or find new ones, steal other good ideas. People didn't quite get that. And so similarly to how I said, like a lot of people have applied Agile practices in a very poor way or without really bringing the Agile mindset along, gives people a bad flavor of Agile. People have cargo culted Spotify, had it not work, and then decided it obviously doesn't work and never worked for Spotify. It absolutely worked for Spotify, but we were a software company. We didn't care if you used our model or not. So that's an important thing to keep in mind when anyone's trying to sell you a sort of model for doing something.
So if you
one last question, Jamie, I've got to know before we wrap it up. What's that picture behind you, Kevin? Is that?
I had that question too.
Is that a rabbit or what is that?
It is. It's a rabbit in a rough and kind of more classic Elizabethan garb. Yes.
So that's not the Alice in Wonderland rabbit?
No, it is not.
Oh, okay. That's what I was thinking.
Excellent. Well, we've run out of time. Thank you very much, Kevin. Really appreciate great information. I appreciate dialing in from Seattle. My nephew is actually based in Bremerton, so I get to go out there. I get to go out there once a year or so, but I'll wait until the weather is a little bit consistently nicer.
And when we can all travel again.
And when it's safe for me to get on board an airplane, that's for sure. Thanks everybody for joining. Kevin, thanks for, go ahead.
Just one quick thing. I know there were other questions. I wasn't watching the chat while I was talking. If you have other questions, feel free to send them to me in Twitter, and I'm very happy to answer them there.
Fantastic, I appreciate that. Thanks a lot, Kevin, again. Thank you everybody for joining us. Hope to see everybody again next Wednesday, and stay safe out there. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.